Good afternoon. I am Lauren Henry, Executive Director of UChicago Alumni and a proud alum of the college. I'm thrilled to welcome you to today's Harper Lecture, Beyond ChatGPT, the Impact of AI on Society. Harper Lectures provide the alumni community with the opportunity to return to the classroom from wherever they are in the world, continuing our tradition of asking hard questions, dialoguing about critical topics, and pursuing new depths of knowledge and understanding. I want to thank you all for joining us for today's discussion on artificial intelligence. We'll look forward to opening the floor to your questions later in the program and ask that you feel free to share your questions via the Q&A box at any time. And with that, it is my pleasure to welcome today's moderator, Dean Torsten Reimer. Dean Reimer is the University Librarian and Dean of the University Library. Dean Reimer, thank you so much for being here with us today, and I will turn the virtual stage over to you.
Thank you very much, Lauren, and welcome again to all of you. It's really great that we have the opportunity to have this discussion today. I just want to sort of briefly set this in context. Artificial intelligence is not something that's new. It's been a topic not just of science fiction, but also of research and to some extent even to commercialization for a few decades. But it was in some ways really the arrival of ChatGPT that has brought AI to the forefront of public debate over the last year. And that's really where it's very strongly centered. As we are sort of gathering here on Zoom today, there are global government and industry representatives meeting in Bletchley Park in England for an international summit on AI safety. And you may have heard this already. Earlier this week, the White House issued an executive order on artificial intelligence, privacy and safety. And that covers topics from healthcare to rental agreements and even labor equity. So AI, just from this brief intro, I think it should be clear, is going to affect really all aspects of life. But I feel it's really in an essential way linked to the mission of libraries and universities. We're dedicated to creating and to broadening access to knowledge. And I'm really excited about how artificial intelligence can help us here. But I'm also terrified of the damage that it could potentially do. As artificial intelligence will increasingly be the filter through which all of us see the world and in some cases engage with the world, we need to make sure this filter enhances our understanding of the world and doesn't distort it. And if we do not achieve that, then I think knowledge that, as the motto of the University of Chicago states, should enrich life, could also be potentially endangering life. So that's really the context of today's discussions. And I'm now proud to be joined by three esteemed University of Chicago faculty members and would like to welcome them on the virtual stage. The first participant is James Evans. He is the Max Palevsky Professor in Sociology. He's also Director of the Knowledge Lab and a Faculty Director of the Master's Program in Computational Social Science and an external professor at the Santa Fe Institute. Our second participant is Nicole P. Marwell. She's professor in the University of Chicago Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy and Practice. She's also faculty director of the school's master's degree in social sector leadership and nonprofit management. And as you can see, Nicole is also a dual degree holder from the University of Chicago. And then last but not least, our third participant is Rebecca Willett. She's a professor of statistics and computer science and Director of Artificial Intelligence at the University of Chicago Data Science Institute. And she also holds a courtesy appointment at the Toyota Technological Institute at Chicago. James, Nicole, Becca, thank you very much for joining me here today. I'm looking forward to a really exciting discussion.
Thanks for having us.
Great to have you here. So to kick this discussion off, we sort of agreed that maybe the first question would be an opportunity for our participants, not just to talk a little bit about AI, but also to sort of situate themselves in that context. So the first question really is, what does artificial intelligence mean for you? Becca, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. Yeah, I think that the main idea of artificial intelligence is to combine computation and data in a way to make machines perform different functions that we typically associate with humans. Things like trying to learn or interact with an environment, make predictions or decisions. And then within the broader world of AI, I think a subset that is particularly interesting to many of us is machine learning, where we're not sort of pre-coding in logical rules so much as we are using data to sort of learn how to make predictions based on examples.
Oh, thank you very much for that concise summary. Nicole, would you like to go next?
Sure. Well, I'm a little bit of an interloper in the field of AI, I would say, because I'm certainly not a computer scientist like Becca. And what I'm really interested in, my own research has always looked at questions of governance, and in particular, how we choose to assign the rights and benefits and responsibilities of citizenship to people within nations and across the globe. And in particular, I've been interested in questions of social welfare. And social welfare has always been an area that has allocated benefits and rights in a quite skeptical way, in a quite stingy way, sometimes in a quite punitive way. And now that we are moving towards using artificial intelligence more and more to make those assignations of rights and benefits and responsibilities, this is where my interest in AI has really come from. And so, we're now using algorithmic models, risk predictions, and other kinds of artificial intelligence to make very consequential decisions for vulnerable people in many different ways in our society. And so, very often we can see that technologies come first as a form of discipline for marginalized populations, but we should be under no illusions that AI is coming for all of us. And so I think that it's particularly important to look at what is happening in domains of social welfare so that we can understand how those experiments or approaches to disciplining our most marginalized may be important for the rest of us as well.
Thank you very much. I think that's you touched on a range of topics that we'll come back to over the course of this discussion. James, would you like to go next? Sorry, James, and I think you're still muted.
Sorry about that. I'm a computational sociologist, and I study knowledge, science, technology, innovation, and I'm also an AI scholar. So I engage with AI in a few different ways. One, I build algorithms with an emphasis on kind of human awareness, being aware of what humans are thinking so that we can build them to collaborate more effectively with people, and taking into account principles and data distributions about what people are doing, thinking, acting, deciding. I also spend a fair bit of time designing interpretations of large, complex models. ChatGPT, GPT-4, has more than 1 trillion parameters. What parameters mean is just each parameter represents an underlying model inside this enormous complex model. And so no one really understands how these models are working. And so we analyze them, my team analyzes them from principles of social networks and cognition and graph theory to understand how they're working and how to make them work better. And also to build kind of AI that helps science and technology, which is something that Becca is also actively engaged in. To me, AI really references a range of different kinds of algorithms. I mean, some are genuinely artificial intelligence in that they're trying to fulfill Alan Turing's kind of mimicking human capacity imitation game, where they're really doing what it is that people do. They're answering questions the way people answer them. I think this is, best exemplified really in the most recent ChatGPT moment. But there's also a range of algorithms, and these are the ones that I'm most interested in, which I'll call augmented intelligence or augmented AI, where we're trying to help or build intelligences that kind of help people solve problems that they couldn't solve on their own. And this requires us to understand more, not less, about humans and human capacity.
Thank you very much. I think that links really nicely into my next question. I mean, in many ways, AI, like other parts of the digital transformation that we've seen over the last few decades, is a tool, and as such, it has the promise that it can really benefit all of us. But as we've also now already heard just in this introduction, there are also some challenges. One that's very much on my mind is in the digital transformation, we've seen that many parts of society have really widely benefited, but there were also others who do not have even basic access to the internet that have effectively suffered from this. And we've seen a widening of the gulf, I think, between underserved communities and those who can fully benefit. I'd really like to hear the view from the panel. Will artificial intelligence accelerate this trend further? And are there ways how we can use AI in an inclusive way to, instead of widening this problem that I've just touched upon, to perhaps try and reduce it? And maybe I'm just playing this back to start with to James.
Sure. I believe that at the current moment that these models will exacerbate many types of inequality and difference in society. I've got a couple of papers that my team's just finished and they're being published, which shows that language models like ChatGPT, they're built on English, and if they're built for even very large but under-resourced languages like Bengali, which has many millions of participants, tens of millions of participants, they end up taking many of the associations that are built from English, the connotations, the references into these other languages, which make the text and the recommendations that come in those languages less familiar, less intuitive. The metaphors they make are disorienting, and people experience them, if they're not in their language, like in their idiom, as not being relevant to the questions that they're asking in a serious way. So I think this is one piece of that challenge. Another is that there are different values that are held by different segments of the population, and the ones that we have the most access to and that we've spent the most time studying are those of white, English-speaking, upper middle class, college-educated students. And it turns out that when you survey how different people feel about their vulnerabilities and what they value in an interaction and with respect to an algorithm, it's very different. And so we're privileging certain classes of values as we try to kind of turn the screws on these algorithms. And finally, these are really built for business and by businesses and not for other classes of questions to which we will typically jerry-rig them. And so those classes of questions and people working in those domains, like science, end up getting worse models and worse performances. I think it's possible to think about these biases and try to begin to to overcome some of these limitations. But it requires us knowing a lot more about human values, about human language, about human behavioral patterns and human needs in a variety of contexts, and equally privileging the people upon whom these AIs are driven, as well as the people who are driving the AIs to do hiring or whatever public service they're doing. So.
Yeah, thank you, James. That's really interesting and parts also perhaps a bit alarming. I know the Data Science Institute here at the University of Chicago has done quite a lot of interesting work, also particularly looking at the aspect of sort of access to resources and the internet and so on. So, Becca, it would be really interesting to get your perspective on this topic as well.
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to highlight that Nicole's done some really fascinating work in this space that I hope she's going to talk about in just a minute. But I think, a little bit more broadly speaking, yes, we are seeing this widening gulf, just like James said. And, we see it in a variety of different ways. First of all, it's affecting the economy and labor markets in ways that are certainly making people nervous and are difficult to predict. How it's going to evolve over the next coming years. In addition, there are things like privacy and hidden biases within AI methods that are causing a large amount of concern for a variety of applications. In addition, there's some things, maybe behind the scenes that people don't always think about when they're thinking about inequities in AI, but most of the systems that many of us are familiar with, like ChatGPT, take a huge toll on the climate. They have an enormous carbon footprint and require huge amounts of water to cool the data storage centers. And so all of these things can, exacerbate disparities among different communities, and are things that I think many people are looking at very carefully and trying to develop mitigation strategies. But that said, I think that's really only one side of the coin. And there's a number of ways in which AI is also helping to even things out. So one of the areas that I work in, like James mentioned, is at the intersection of AI and science. So trying to use AI to fuel the scientific discovery process. And what's emerging is that AI is just going to help us make discoveries at a much more rapid pace. And this means that we think we're going to be able to, for instance, develop new drugs and new pharmaceuticals that can target diseases that are predominantly in underserved communities. We hope that we're going to be able to use these tools to build new microbial communities that can help break down plastics. We'd like to make our energy infrastructure more robust so we have fewer blackouts and brownouts, or even improve our climate forecast or design new sustainable materials. These are all things that the sciences and the engineering communities have been studying for a long time, but it's just a very slow and laborious process. And with some of the developing AI and machine learning models, I think we're giving people a whole new set of tools for approaching the scientific method and helping us discover new opportunities much more quickly that I think are going to be important across the board, especially to vulnerable communities.
Yeah, thank you very much for sort of combining that perspective on both the challenges, but also some opportunities. Nicole?
Yeah, it's just been very interesting listening to both James and Becca talk about their answer to this question. I feel like something that's coming from both of them that is a really critical aspect of how AI develops is this really fundamental question of what are the data inputs into AI? Because is anyone familiar with the phrase in statistics, garbage in, garbage out, would tell you what's going into your model is the thing that's really driving what's coming out of your model in terms of decisions. And, James talked about the ways in which we need to have a much wider diversity of inputs into models in order to essentially, the way I heard it, essentially preserve the diversity of the human family in terms of different languages and different contexts and different politics and so on. And in some ways, to the extent that we're not improving our data inputs, we're going to have a certain kind of standardization or homogenization, which I think is probably something we're not really interested in very much. But if we're not careful about thinking about those questions and investing on the data input side, those could be some of the unanticipated or maybe anticipated but unwelcome kinds of consequences. Torsten, you had mentioned questions about the internet and the divide that we're all very well aware now exists in terms of internet access. And as Becca said, that's an area where I've been doing some research lately. And I guess one of the points that I would want to make in terms of inequality around internet access is, once people, we all seem to agree that people should have access to the internet if they want it, and they should be able to afford access to the internet if they want it. One issue that our research team has been thinking a little bit about lately is once you open up internet connectivity to communities that have traditionally been excluded from it, you also open them up to a whole host of privacy and security concerns in terms of their own personal data, which they may not be very well aware of and which they may not understand how to take steps to combat. And so even as you bridge the digital divide in access, you might open up a new divide in terms of privacy and security.
Yeah, I mean, this what you just touched upon is a topic that's very close to my heart. I recently spoke to a fellow librarian, a public librarian in a large and very wealthy European city, and she told me that during the pandemic lockdowns, they had a large number of people sitting outside with laptops because they had no access to the internet otherwise. And on the first day when they opened their door, the first person walking through the door said, "I was not able to access my internet and my email for 2 months. And I'm so glad you're back open again because I'm cut off from the world." I think some of the issues that you just described, I think, go very much right to the heart of what in particular public libraries are trying to do, and can only be so effective as a safety net because they're also not very well resourced. But I'd really like to stay a little bit on the topic of bias. And as you will have all have heard from this discussion, bias plays a critical role in AI, I think, both in the way how the algorithms are designed, but then crucially also in how they are trained. And in some cases, these are very, I think I understand, complex undertakings where maybe the people who develop the code might not necessarily be involved in training it and might find some very interesting surprises in what their code in the end does based on data that came into it. So we now see already AI used more and more in also critical domains, hiring, credit scoring, access to financial resources, also the justice system. Before I came to the United States last year, I read that in some cases in the US, judges are using AI expert systems that guide them on sentencing. And some of these systems in the way they are trained recommend harsher punishment to defendants of color, because that's the conclusion that they've come to based on the training data. So there's a whole aspect with access to wider services, but also how we're going to be treated in society, for which is going to be crucial that we understand and mitigate those biases. So what approaches can we really use to understand, reduce, and where maybe reducing might not be possible, mitigating those biases? Maybe Nicole, as you sort of touched upon this, you might want to kick us off on that question.
Sure. I think for me, when I try and think about these problems, without having, the sort of technical knowledge about how you might program things differently to reduce bias, the thing that really is kind of the overarching driver for me is that so many of these algorithms are based on this concept of risk. And in that sense, what it is it's not giving you an individually calibrated decision. What it's giving you is a risk for you based on the characteristics that you share with others. And so the idea of risk, the idea of probability, I think everybody is going to need to learn probability a lot better than they currently understand it as we move forward in AI. That's one thing. But this idea of risk really raises the challenge of, do we think that people should be judged based on themselves as an individual, which of course is a fundamental aspect of how we understand rights in democratic societies, or are we judging people based on their membership in groups? That is to say, the characteristics that they share with others on for which risk scores can be created. And, one of our colleagues here at the University of Chicago at the law school, Aziz Hook, he wrote a very interesting paper a few years ago called, something along the lines of, is there a right to a human decision? Meaning in the context of, for example, setting bail with algorithmic assistance in a court, do individuals have the right to have that final judgment made, not by a machine, not by an algorithm, but by a human? And a very interesting and somewhat unsettling conclusion that he drew of analysis of the legal situation here in the United States in any case was that no, we don't have a right to a human decision, which of course lays a legal foundation for what could turn out to be some very difficult and terrifying situations where you are in fact judged not as an individual, but as a member of a group.
Thank you, Nicole. That's a really interesting perspective, also from a legal side. James, might you want to share your take on bias with us next?
Sure. I think in addition to Nicole's mention of probability that we need to kind of wrap our heads around, another thing that we'll need to think about are objectives. These models have objectives, and one of the challenges with objectives is it's very rare for something that's really valued, really important, for us to have a direct measure of that objective. For example, if we want to admit a student into the University of Chicago, if we wanted to hire somebody, and what we really want to know is, will this person be an amazing student? You know, will they broaden and diversify our student body? Will they learn things? Can we help them? But we don't know that. We don't know if the people that we hire are going to be good. And so we use surrogate objectives. And so I think that's another concept that is really important here in this context of bias, because the surrogate objectives are the things that are measurable, but they're not really the things that we want. And one of the big challenges in bias surrounding these systems is when the surrogates really deviate in ways that we didn't expect from the things that we really want. I think one of the most exciting and terrifying examples is from another colleague of ours at the university, Sindel Mulanathan, Jens Ludwig, and some colleagues had a wonderful paper in Science magazine, kind of a top scientific magazine, that showed that there's this huge healthcare reimbursement system that's driven by insurance algorithms, and it was responsible at the time that this paper came out 2.5 years ago for like 47% of the healthcare reimbursements of U.S. Patients as a result of doctor-patient visits. Well, what they found was that historically, the algorithm at the time was using as a measure of health, right? The objective was health. They wanted to figure out, hey, we want to reimburse certain levels of health. If someone's sick, we want to reimburse them more so that they can get more health care, right? But they didn't have a measure of health, so they used historical healthcare reimbursements to people like that person as a measure of health. Now, the problem is persons of color are much less likely, or historically have been less likely, to go into the physician's office. And so when they show up, they're likely to be sicker, and they have, as a result, and they also have, there's discrimination about the level of care that they require. And so this algorithm, which was responsible for an enormous proportion, almost half of the US healthcare reimbursements, required Black persons to be twice as sick on average as white persons to get the same level of healthcare. That's, I mean, I can't even, it doesn't even sound like that's real, but this is just 2.5 years ago. So I think that's the terrifying thing. We need to, when we understand these models, they have very simple objectives typically, and we need to understand what those objectives are and how they deviate from our real objectives. Now, the good thing, and I think this speaks back to Nicole's question earlier, is that when you audit these systems in terms of inputs, outputs, and their internal representations, do they think that we think about new cases, then you can fix them sometimes a lot easier than you can fix a human decision maker. So it's a lot easier in some ways to like turn the algorithm, you know, that's associated with this particular bias, to rebalance or reweight that bias. It's a lot easier than it is to reweight the estimations of all of those discriminatory healthcare readjusters or all of the judges inside New York. You know, so I think that the dark side is that, you know, these objectives can be buried deep in the system and they can be causing all kinds of hidden bias. On the other hand, when we find that bias, if we audit them sufficiently, we can change it often much more quickly than we can a human system.
Thank you. I think that is a really interesting perspective, both terrifying but hopeful. Rebecca, how do you view bias and the chances to address it?
Yeah, I think, you know, the points that Nicole raised about, you know, when do we want to insist that a human is in the decision-making loop, and James's point about surrogate objectives are right on point. I think we've also probably seen a lot of examples in the news about people training these models with non-representative or skewed data. So for instance, trying to make predictions about who would be a good fit for a particular job where they have, mostly historical data of white people in high-tech jobs, and that's not predictive of how well a person of color would perform in that job. And so there have been efforts to try to ensure that we are training these systems with much more balanced data, which is a positive. But I do think that these things can be extremely challenging. And it's not always about bias. So Nicole raised this point about people using AI to decide who should be let out on bail. And there was this famous case study about a very well-known system, machine learning system, for predicting after someone had been arrested, what was their risk of recidivism, of going out and then being arrested again for a future crime. And the idea was, well, if we could accurately predict recidivism, then we could use that to decide who should be let out on bail or not. And ProPublica magazine released an article saying the system is not fair, because if we look at all the people labeled high risk, but who actually didn't go on to reoffend, the fraction was much higher, almost twice as many for Black people as for white people. And this caused a bit of a scandal, but then the company that had developed the software came back and they said, yeah, but if we look at a different metric, if we look instead to say, for all the people with a particular score, what is the chance of recidivism? Then we actually see that we've got similar levels for different racial groups. And so just like Nicole said, this comes down to, statistics and priors and imbalances in historical data. And ultimately, the challenge becomes how we as a society decide what is a fair decision-making rule. And there have been mathematical results that have said that it's actually impossible to have a decision-making rule that satisfies multiple different definitions of fairness simultaneously. So this isn't a matter of better coding or better data. This is a matter of us figuring out what we as a society really value and figuring out how to best kind of fold those values into our AI systems.
Or to decide, sorry, Becca, or to decide that the ultimate decision should lay with a human.
Great point. Absolutely. Yeah. Another point I want to make is that, often we'll see people worried a lot about hidden biases behind these systems. But something that actually keeps me up at night a little bit more is the potential for deliberate misuse of these systems. So for instance, whenever one of these systems is being developed, the developer has got some incentives in mind. And as an example, think about a social media company that is trying to decide what posts they're going to promote and put at the top of your timeline when you log in, what you're most likely to see and what you're less likely to see. So those companies are using AI tools in order to maximize human engagement with their system. And that can come at a pretty substantial cost. There are examples where those systems are maximizing engagement and hence maximizing profit, but causing serious documented mental health issues among minors. And more sobering examples of these tools being used in countries where they have much less stringent regulations and rules than in the US. So for instance, back in, I think, 2017, Myanmar's armed forces were trying to boost propaganda against the Rohingya Muslims using social media. And unfortunately, these posts were getting a lot of engagement. And even when the company tried to develop mitigation strategies, allowing people to flag harmful content, those flags were marked as a form of engagement and the AI system boosted them even more. And so I think that not only do we have to worry about biases, but we really have to think very carefully and very critically about the incentives that underlie the developers of these systems. And that should play a big role in determining how much we trust them and the context in which we should be willing to use them.
Can I throw in just one additional thought, which I love those poignant examples in misinformation and disinformation. I think one of the things as a human scientist, as a social scientist, is that these AI algorithms and their bias are allowing us to rethink the distribution of human biases in these systems as well. Because it's not like the human systems weren't biased in racial and other ways. I mean, those systems are producing the data that are allowing us to use these algorithms. And one, I think, interesting and hopeful use is that we can use these algorithms to really understand what the biases of human systems are so that we can try to correct for them. One example is a paper by Jens Ludwig and colleagues that basically showed this last summer. It's a preprint, but it basically looked at bail decisions that's related to the case that Nicole and Becca were talking about. And it showed basically that not only were just like factors of the case relevant, but like the facial images were relevant and accounted for almost the same variation in ways that we couldn't have anticipated before. For example, if people are more fat-faced, they're much more likely to go out, to be given the right to go out and bail than thin-faced people. Similarly, people who are like less shaven or kempt in their, hair and appearance are much more likely to be let out on bail. So I think these algorithms also allow us to kind of audit human systems in ways that can be illuminating and can allow us to think about the things that we need to regulate about those AIs.
Yeah, thank you all. That's already prompted like half a dozen different questions for me, but I'm also mindful that now is probably a good time to take some questions from the audience in. And just to say, we may not necessarily look for an answer for all three panelists, depending on what the question is, so we have a chance to look at different questions. Let's just pick this up and see how we go. So the first question that I would like us to take is about the international focus. So much of what we've been discussing here, and also much of what is currently featured in the press on AI research and development, is perhaps unsurprisingly focused on the United States. What do we know about artificial intelligence in other countries? For example, what do we know about AI development in China? Who would like to take this one on?
I'm happy to take a shot. I think there is a lot of sophistication in many countries, including China. I've seen a number of very impressive results coming out of their schools and universities, as well as their companies. And to some extent, that's exciting, right? It's fun to be part of this international intellectual community. And certainly it's generated some healthy competition. But I think it is important to note that these different countries do have different rules and regulations that govern how AI is used. And even though AI regulation itself is in its nascency, we still have regulations about what kinds of things we can do in deciding who gets in and out of who gets released on bail, or who gets a mortgage, or what's legal in terms of college admissions, or a variety of other facets of daily life where people are thinking about using AI. And those protections are not always quite as robust in other countries. And I think one of the things that is concerning is that there certainly is an opportunity for an authoritarian government or for different political groups to try to use these AI tools in order to surveil or subjugate different populations. And so on one hand, the level of international sophistication is deeply impressive and exciting. But I think at the same time, it definitely poses some risks for global stability.
I'll just mention one other thing. I chaired I was research director for this Critical Technologies Initiative by Congress this last year. So I spent a lot of time looking at AI as well as other critical technologies in China versus the US versus Europe and the rest of the world. And the sophistication of Chinese AI is really dramatically jumped over the last 10 years, not only in terms of the number of publications and the number of scientists, but also the amount of disruption, the degree to which those papers end up representing for the rest of the world turning points and important research is also critical. One thing in this story, though, is that, on the one hand, exactly as Becca says, there are different use cases that have really complex ethical implications. Another is how to manage the scientific system itself. There are recently a number of regulations that propose, for example, separation or a non-inclusion of Chinese scientists in U.S. research on certain areas, for example, of artificial intelligence. And we show that while that would definitely harm the scientific development of AI in China, it would also really strongly harm scientific development here. So it turns out that the work that collaborates, people across between China and the US versus those are the countries that collaborate more than any other two countries in the world, and the impact of the things on which they collaborate is greater than the impact of the work from either country. So I think it's a really interesting and complicated global landscape.
And I think what you just described, James, really goes to the heart of research, I think, on any controversial topic or anything that has sort of strategic input. And it's actually a really interesting case, I think, that in some ways goes beyond the matter of AI for scientific collaboration. But that's not really the main topic that we're here for. Nicole, was there anything you wanted to add on that question, or should we move on to the next?
I think we should take another question. It was great answers from Becca and James.
Good. So the next one takes us into a slightly different directions. Are the recent breakthroughs in artificial intelligence and machine learning already triggering a re-evaluation of our understanding of human intelligence, its evolution, and maybe its real performance? Are we suddenly realizing that our brains are not that magnificent, extraordinary, and unique, is what the audience member would like to know.
James, that feels like a question for you.
I'm at a workshop at the Santa Fe Institute today, which is not the only thing, but is also interested in part in thinking about human intelligence and computational intelligence. I think that there are a whole host of things. Every time a new algorithm comes out, then the world basically tries to test, okay, can we trip it up? Can we make it look dumb, is it really as smart as it is, or is it actually cueing on other very subtle and fragile patterns that are not robust and flexible in the same way that human cognition is robust and flexible. And lo and behold, yes, we can often find very kind of fragile basis for certain things, but that has led to more robust development, a whole kind of subfield of machine learning, which is about robustness to these kinds of things. And so increasingly we're building what I'll call kind of personal AI models. And so for example, a former student of mine published a paper that shows we can build a personal AI chess model that can predict this particular person's moves inside this chess context. And what's interesting is chess is a case where we have for decades AI models that are better, smarter, whatever at chess than humans are. And he shows that basically by taking into account a personal model and the kind of the best possible chess model that's available, you can find a model that's in between that can communicate better with people, that people can collaborate with and actually perform much better than a person could basically collaborate with, like an inscrutable, whatever, objectively better AI. So I think that we are learning things about the distribution of complex human biases. And here by bias, I don't mean discriminatory. I mean just the pattern, the heuristics, the rules by which we solve very specific problems in the context of playing games, making decisions in our lives, et cetera. And so I think that trying to basically build personal models to predict very individual human behavior has revealed a lot of interesting, I would say, less limitations and more, discoveries about the efficient and flexible rules that we use to make sense and take action in our complex world.
And I think maybe I might add in a different angle on the question, which is that I'm not sure it's the right question to be asking, which is smarter, the human or the machine? Like, are we learning that, the human brain is not as unique and special as we thought? I mean, sure. But, I think there's a bigger question there, which is, what are the effects of the growing reliance on machine knowledge and artificial intelligence on human beings? And I guess if you're a sort of radical interspecies egalitarian, you could say, well, what are the effects of human behavior on machines? But to me, that seems like not as important a question, and call that a human bias, but there it is.
Right. No. But to be clear, I mean, my point in this last response was just that there's some collective intelligence that we can learn about and potentially, achieve, new insights in the way that Becca was talking about in the context of science. They can also make us dumber, not only because they collaborate with us in ways that add complex biases, but also, simply by allowing us to forget certain capacities that we may have treasured and valued before.
Well, thank you both. Unless Becca, there's anything that you wanted to add, then let's move on to your next question. It is one that may not be unfamiliar, because I think we hear about this in a similar way from students. So another audience member asks, one thing I hear from people in my organization is the fear that artificial intelligence will reduce the number of people needed in jobs. How do you see how AI will impact the workforce?
I'll take a first cut at that, just because I've been involved in some research this last year that looks at that. It turns out, this doesn't answer the whole question, but if you look company by company, those companies that both develop, license, and use AI more intensively have a higher proportion of job additions, both in AI-related jobs and non-AI-related jobs. If you look in the scientific workspace, this was work that was done by a former postdoc who's now a professor at Tsinghua University in electrical engineering. He basically shows that, if you look at the distribution of scientists who are using AI in their scientific work, initially it looks biased. It looks like, oh, there are fewer younger scientists who are using AI in their research. And it turns out it's just because they're advancing more quickly. So they're more senior scientists quicker. And so the skewed distribution is towards the upper scale. So I would say on the positive side, it does look like, there are possible engagements, and company by company, we definitely see advances. On the other hand, entire industries and classes of jobs are definitely being replaced. And one of the biggest concerns that I have is when you look at the increase of AI across the workforce, while on the one hand, it levels up certain classes of skill, like English language, the capacity for a realtor to write a description of a house. It's easier for someone with a lower educational experience to be able to do that in a passable way. On the other hand, the burden of reskilling is much higher at the lower end of the skill and education distribution as a result of AI job displacement. So I think there's exciting and interesting possibilities, but there are costs that are associated with these changes, and these costs are disproportionately borne by, by less educated minorities.
If I could just add in something on that question. One of the interesting things I think about the use of artificial intelligence in various kinds of automation in different employment contexts is the frequency with which it breaks and needs a human intervention to fix it. And so we've seen some quite interesting research on a lot of on some occupations or some new businesses that think they're going to run entirely on automation, and then it turns out the automation doesn't respond the way that you would hope. People have questions, people get decisions that they're unhappy with, and now you need humans to come in and figure out what the problem is and fix it and so on in order for the business to be able to stay in business. Let me just give you an example from a book from a couple of years ago by Virginia Eubanks. She tells this story of something that happened to her. She had just moved and started a new job, and her husband was in a terrible accident and landed in the hospital and had incredibly high healthcare costs that came to their insurance. And the insurance company's algorithm said, oh, new insured, really big bill, must be fraud. And so they denied these claims while Virginia's trying to take care of her husband, trying to deal with a new job, trying to deal with all the things. And it cost her many, many, many hours of trying to get past the algorithmic decision. And that was only possible to get to the right decision once she was able to really talk to a human who could think outside the model. And so those kinds of jobs, I think, which may or may not be good jobs, which may or may not be meaningful jobs to people, which may feel like, you know, being in the service industry, serving machines, we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Becca, if there isn't anything you wanted to add to that specifically?
No, I think James and Nicole were just so fluent and articulate. No problem at all. Thank you.
Good. Then it's sort of slowly time coming to the end. I just wanted to maybe throw one thought in before I ask my final question. Before I came to the University of Chicago, I worked in London at the British Library. The British Library is doing a really interesting research project together with the Alan Turing Institute and other academic partners. It's called Living with Machines, and it uses AI technology to look at information about the Industrial Revolution and how it changed society. So it's both exploring what technology allows us to do with historic materials, but also trying to understand how a previous technology revolution impacted society. And I think that might be something that some of you might be interesting to take a look at. But I would really like to close this with one question that's very close to my heart, and it was partly prompted by a panel that was actually hosted at the British Library a few years ago on AI, where many members of the audience kept coming back to the classic science fiction question, when is AI going to be so powerful that it's going to kill us all? And there was a member of the audience who said, look, I can't answer that question, but what I can tell you is that you're right now giving all your data for free for the social media companies, and they use that to build AI models. And I'm paraphrasing what the academic said, but it broadly was, they use that to build AI models to sell you products that you don't need and that will harm the planet, to disenfranchise you from the political process, or to make you angry at your neighbor, to help break societal consensus down, and then to make you unemployed because you can be replaced with an algorithm. And these are all things that are already happening, and I'm much more concerned about those and what we can do than if a hypothetical general AI might want to kill us in 50 years, because if the next 50 years look like this, I'm not sure I want to be alive. That's sort of what he said. And what he pointed to was, in fact, the only way of how we can prevent this is having a broad debate and then coming up with effective regulation. So as a sort of little bit of a closing quickfire round, it would be really great to hear, do you believe there can and should be effective AI regulation? And do you have one or two things that you'd really like to see on the agenda? And let's maybe start with Becca on this one.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it's ultimately going to be very context dependent. So we talked before about deciding who should or should not be let out on bail. If we were to decide that an AI tool should play a role, then I think it's totally appropriate that we should have some insight into how that tool was built. What were the criteria? What was the data? And how we anticipate that it could best be used. And I think regulating those types of things is reasonable. On the other hand, we've seen proposals for regulation that say things like, well, you know, we should know exactly what kind of data it was trained on. And while that's maybe fine for something like bail and recidivism, it's a much tougher proposition when you're talking about something like ChatGPT that was trained on all the text we could find anywhere in the world. So you could give me all of that text, and there's not a whole lot that I could do with it that's meaningful from a regulatory standpoint. And so I think that, there are a number of settings in which regulation would be helpful, but I think there are also settings in which we don't currently have the right technical tools to develop meaningful regulations. And let me just give you like a concrete example of why we need good tools. So people have been studying privacy laws for a longer time, and we have things like HIPAA laws here in the US or GDPR in the European Union. And these were built around a particular principle of privacy called K-satisfiability, which sounded really good. But one of my colleagues in computer science, Aloni Cohen, actually proved that there was a leak associated with this criterion, that you could actually exploit this leak and violate people's privacy. And so this rule that was that was developed by people with limited technical tools at their disposal ultimately did not afford people the protections that they were feeling like they were guaranteed. And the risk is that we're going to do something similar with AI, that we're going to come up with the best kind of rules that we can, but without a real deep understanding of AI and machine learning foundations, of statistical challenges, or of possible security flaws and failure modes, that some of those regulations will be vacuous. And so I think regulations can play an important role, but it's certainly not an easy thing for us to implement, and is going to require continued engagement with both, stakeholders as well as technology developers.
Thank you very much. James and then Nicole, can I get a sort of, I know this will be a bit of a big ask, a couple of sentence, quick answer as we wrap up?
Quick answer. So one is, I think there is a challenge associated with like building regulation with respect to things like ChatGPT and applying it to very narrow special case use scenarios. And I think that's the situation that we're seeing right now. But I believe, this is the sci-fi response, is that foundations are important, but there are many things about these large models that we do not understand their basic foundations of the dynamic processes underlying them, and that we're going to need to regulate them with other AIs, adversarially designed to audit them, to discipline them, to turn them off. And so I think we need to really build AI capacity inside the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Department of Justice, and other places that can tune AIs to regulate other AIs.
Thank you.
Interesting, James. I never heard that before. I guess what I would just add on, I agree with both of what Becca said and what James has said. I think that regulation is important, and just as important, if perhaps not more important, is the development of an ethics around the use of AI, because the regulation is always going to lag the technology. We are always going to be playing regulatory catch up. And so it's really critical that people who are involved in AI have their sense of ethics around the kinds of decisions they should be making, have really worked on developing that. And I think, speaking to the international question that was raised earlier, I think one of the big challenges is how do you come to agreement on an ethics around the use of these tools when you're dealing with people living in very different national and cultural contexts, particularly, as Becca mentioned, the divide between democratic societies and autocratic societies. And so I think that is a huge challenge that is related to regulation, but not the same.
Yeah, well, thank you very much.
I'd just like to very briefly add that there is also potential for regulations to be misused. So about a decade ago in North Carolina, they outlawed using any model for predicting sea level rise except linear regression for basing North Carolina policies on. And so I guess they felt like they understood linear regression better than other models, but it was extremely limiting and had substantial implications. And I think that, as we develop regulations, we can see the potential benefits, but there are some potential pitfalls there too that we need to be cautious about.
I think that's a really good warning to end on. We've had many, many more questions, so I'd like to thank everyone in the audience for being so engaged. Maybe we need to pick this topic up again another time, and I would like to thank my wonderful 3 panelists. As always, when talking to faculty here, I learn a lot. This was really exciting, and I'm now turning things back over to Lauren to conclude our time together.
Thank you so much, Dean Reimer, and to all of our panelists for such an insightful conversation. And I will echo the thanks to the audience. You all asked more than 100 questions. I would expect no less from a University of Chicago audience. And as I think you said, I think we probably need to think about revisiting this topic again in the future. In the meantime, I hope that you all will continue to engage with the university and with our alumni community, whether that's attending another event, volunteering, providing philanthropic support for faculty or students, or simply spreading the word about the groundbreaking work and thought leadership happening here at the university. You can learn more about opportunities to do all of these things and more on the Alumni and Friends website, which has been shared in chat. And most importantly, I just want to thank you all again for coming together with the University of Chicago community today. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your week.